social media. We're so excited to be back with you again today, and we just wanted to share with you a little bit more from Scripture that Rob and I have been just reading together, and we hope that you enjoy our discussion today. So we're going to be reading from John 8. It's John 8, 1 through 11. It says, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again in the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to us, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his fingers. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and he wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more."
This is actually one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture. First, because we see Jesus interacting with a woman, which is not unusual for Jesus, but for the culture of the time, it's super unusual for a Jew to interact with a woman that isn't his spouse. But second, because, and this may be totally the wrong reason to be intrigued by this section, but what in the world did he write on the ground?
I want to know.
Did he write her sins on the ground? Did he write their sins on the ground?
I could just picture him being like a little kid, like drawing doodles in the dirt.
Yes.
He's just
like, here's some text, here's some, stick figures, I'm
Yeah.
just going to draw.
Yep.
Like,
that's what he does in my mind.
So I love that about this, because again, it's kind of, like you said, there's an innocence to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, he doesn't fight with them. He doesn't fight with her. He just kind of kneels down next to her and starts drawing on the ground. So that was, like, for years, that has been, like, my most funny, intriguing thing about this passage. But then I read it again recently, and there's so many things that jumped out at me. Number one is, so it says they caught her in the act of adultery. Now, how in the world could a group of men catch this woman in the act of adultery without sinning themselves? I mean, that's my first question.
Yeah.
The second question is, where's the guy?
I bet he's like one of them.
That's kind of my question is in that culture, women were not thought very highly of. Yeah. And so the guys were the men were the ones that for the most part had the power. And I don't know if, people really understand how adultery works, but adultery, it takes two people. And in this case, it says she was caught in the act, which means, yes, she was there and she was committing a sin, but where's the guy? Because the guy in that culture would have had the power, so ultimately, in my view at least, the guy had more responsibility to do what was right in that situation, and obviously he didn't. He didn't do any kind of leading, as a man should, but yet we don't hear his sins being called out in front of everybody. And then I think, okay, so she's caught in the act, again, of adultery. That to me, I mean, not to get too specific or graphic, but chances are she wasn't probably wearing a whole lot of clothes.
That's what I wondered, because they exposed her sin, but also how exposed was she, in the moment? And then
everything.
Yeah, and then I'm going through my brain of, well, what all is classified as adultery? like, I guess even like kissing someone else that would not be your spouse could be considered.
Yeah.
And so if they were just setting her, like, if in my head the way it's playing out is correct, like they're just setting her up with probably one of the other Pharisees just to trick her because they knew like rumors about her. Maybe she could have been like super exposed physically, or maybe she wasn't. And like, I hope that she wasn't, because that would just be
horrible,
even worse. And could even be why Jesus decided to write in the ground, because he didn't want to be tempted by what was in front of him, so he just bent down and wrote on the ground instead.
Or for her sake.
Or
to protect her.
That's true.
To protect her virtue, I guess, even though she was, like it says, she was caught. But so I wonder about that setup issue as well, because it says that they did it to try and trick Jesus.
Yeah.
So this whole scene, even though they're putting her on the spot, it's like the most embarrassing, humiliating thing that she could experience or go through, whether it's, an emotional thing because she was caught in this act, or whether it was emotional and physical and she was totally exposed.
Right.
It still
wasn't even about her.
It wasn't even about her. She's just the patsy. She's the scapegoat to try and trick Jesus. And I love Jesus' response, which first he kneels down, which to me is a communication of, even though he had every right to claim authority over her and over the whole situation, he chooses not to. He humbles himself and he kneels next to her. He gets on her level and doesn't condemn her outright. Even at the very end, he doesn't condemn her. And there's so much comfort and love in his actions that just blow me away.
Well, and it's so simple too. Like, I think so many times we make such a huge deal of how to gain forgiveness, and we like forget that we literally don't have to do anything but be there to take it in and accept. And because he just, like, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words. Neither do I. Go and sin no more. Like, done.
But see, that's also like a huge thing to me, is he says, I don't condemn you, but then he calls her to action.
Yep.
He's like, I'm not gonna condemn you, but from here on out, change your life. And that's true for all of us, is like with our past, because we all have pasts, And I know I'm going to sin in the future, even though I don't want to. But it's looking at those situations where God has every right to condemn us and with the worst punishment, and yet his response is to say to us, I'm not going to condemn you, but take this situation, put it behind you, and don't do it again. Which is huge. Which I think goes back to, which I love this part about this passage. It says that as he calls out the Pharisees for what they're trying to do, and he says, okay, like, fine, you want to stone her? Yep, you're absolutely right. That's what the law of Moses says. So let's start with the first one. The first one that, doesn't have any sin in their life, you can cast the first stone. And then, there's kind of like this undercurrent of, you throw the first stone, but just realize that we're going to get to you too.
Right.
And you're going to, if you condemn her, guess what? You also can be condemned for, the sins that are in your life. And that's where you see, and that's why I think that part is so cool, because you see the oldest first start to drop their stones and walk away.
Right.
And it's kind of that, to me, it speaks to that wisdom of, these guys have lived, a long life, have experienced a ton, and by that same token, they've got the most sin in their life.
Yeah.
They've lived the longest, and so they've got the most sin in their life, and they're the first ones to realize, dang, I am worse than this woman, for the sins that are in my life, and I can't throw that rock, because there's 10 times that many rocks that should be thrown at me, And so it's like from the oldest to the youngest, they slowly start dropping their rocks. And it doesn't say how long Jesus sat there drawing on the ground. Like how long it took from the oldest Pharisee to the youngest for them all to drop their rocks. I mean, so he could be sitting there with that lady on the ground, drawing in the sand for an hour. I mean, it could have been that long before they all drop their rocks and finally all walk away. And then Jesus kind of, like he doesn't know what's going on. He lifts his head up and he's like, oh, hey, everybody's gone. Where'd they all go?
I was a part of a spiritual activity where we actually did this. But it was a really cool experience because you weren't like picking up rocks to throw at someone. Like you were picking up a rock and writing your sin symbolism on it, or writing your trouble on that rock. And then instead of it being something that you carried around that was a burden for you and that you held on to, you tossed it into the lake and you let it go. And that was like how you got rid of that burden on yourself. But
that's great symbolism.
It is. That was a really good. It was a really good activity and awesome to experience. But I can just imagine like being back on the dock throwing those rocks, because for some people it took a really long time to let it go. And like for others, it's like, great, I'm ready to get rid of this, goodbye. Which can be like a testament to how we are in like whether we're living a worldly life or a biblical life, because we just get so stuck in the enjoyment of what the world gives. And so even if it's not being caught in adultery, which is, in the eyes of people in the world is a huge sin,
right.
Just simply as like telling lies, or just not being truthful with people, or just
it could be as simple as just not putting God on the throne.
Right, or just not, literally not doing what you're supposed to do every day.
Right.
And not wanting to let that go, because that's your part of your freedom that you have to live as who you are. But the one person in this whole entire story that could have thrown a stone never even had one to put down, which is so important to me when I read this, because he never picked one up, even though he was already at the ground. All these other people had stones in their hands ready, and he never even picked one up, because there's no point. He's not going to. He could have thrown one because he hadn't sinned. He could have picked one up like everyone else, but he just sat there before the whole entire thing was going to forgive her the whole entire time, no matter what.
And how incredible is it to think that they probably showed up with dragging the woman with stones already in their hand.
Probably so.
Just they were intent on murder. Man, that's a great, I love that spiritual activity, just because, honestly, I think about my own life and the mistakes that I've made, and I think about the size of the stone.
I know.
That I would have to, to write all of the things that I've, done, and all of the things that I need to let go. And then I think, about the passage, Jesus says, take up my yoke, my burden is light. And I'm just thinking, what size does that, if I'm trying to let go, or I'm trying to, take up his, yoke, what size is my rock then?
Yeah.
Compared to the one that I try and lug around sometimes, what's the size of the rock that he gives me? Right. And that's just, that imagery in my head is huge.
I also can't imagine how strong Jesus is, having to carry around all of those rocks, because my rock would 100% be like the size of Mount Rushmore, just in my mind. And so the fact that he is holding all of those burdens is just incredible to think about.
And again, his attitude in this particular, story, that he's the only one there that has the right to stand. And like you said, he doesn't have to kneel at all. He could get down, pick up a huge rock, and be the first to throw it with murder in his eyes, because again, like you said, he's the innocent one that could, the one without sin, and yet his attitude is to lower himself which is the picture of his whole life, descending from heaven for the very purpose of sacrifice, to kneel next to her and just be on her level. And not even, through this whole thing, he doesn't even really address her until, like you said, the very last thing is, 7 words or whatever.
Yeah.
And then his whole thing is words of love.
Right.
I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more.
Which I think also proves to people who aren't believers or aren't in church that you don't have to be perfect to come. Because I'm sure by her choice, she would not have gone to the feet of Jesus.
Right.
Because she probably was filled with shame and would have felt exposed if she went up there, because then everyone would have known that the rumors were true about her.
Especially now.
Right. And so the fact that she's completely imperfect, no telling what her state is in that moment coming to Jesus, that just expresses so much more how imperfect you can be to show up at the feet of Jesus and still get the same forgiveness that anyone else does.
And it's also kind of interesting that in this whole story, she says 3 words. No one, Lord. So, but even in that, I think there's a pretty powerful lesson that I think, and I could be, adding something to the text that isn't there, but I think the spirit of what I'm saying is there, and that is that she recognizes that he does have power.
Right.
Like she addresses him as Lord, as teacher, as,
right.
So she recognizes that, and obviously what he says has power even over the Pharisees because they respond to what he's told them. So I can imagine the stuff going through her head. This guy has real power, more so than the Pharisees have that we're going to kill me. This guy short-circuited everything, and this, he has real power. So I got to imagine, even if, we don't know what happened to her, but I have to imagine that after this interaction, at the very minimum, she has to invest some time in figuring out, who this Jesus person was, if she didn't, if she hadn't at least heard about him before. So powerful.
It really is. I just keep reading it and keep thinking that, I just reading through this, it makes some of the scriptures that make no sense, take the plank out of your own eye before you see the speck in someone else's, or I know I just butchered that, but the fact of thinking of taking a huge, 2x4 out of someone's eye is what comes to my head instead of a splinter. This makes sense to me because it's okay, if you haven't had any sins, don't throw a stone. You can't look at someone else's sin until you recognize your own. And even then, you shouldn't be pointing out their flaws. You should be loving them to Jesus and explaining forgiveness, which then brings me back to the Lord's Prayer. And because a while back we did a study, and the woman who led the study, it was Lisa Turkhurst, and she said that we're supposed to pray the Lord's Prayer constantly because it says, forgive those who trespass against us. Because literally we're accepting forgiveness from the Lord and letting it flow through us to other people. And so that's what Jesus was doing, was just letting it flow out. No conditions, just saying you're forgiven, it's fine. Not even going down to the T of all of her sins.
Yeah, not listing anything out.
Not counting, a huge thing right now for people all over social media. I don't know if you've seen this, but lots of millennials, they post this thing and it's called a body count. And it's exactly what this woman would have had was a body count. And so, people post those things and I think to myself, if you can list those out, how much more should you be listing Lord forgive me, of everything, And so that's what I think when I think about this, is that they knew all of the issues that she had and probably all the people that she'd been with and how many times she'd committed adultery. And to think that people just like willingly provide that information on social media to people, like, for one, it makes them, of course, to this world, it's an awesome thing to have that many on your list, which breaks my heart. But then on the second note, it's just like, it's so much more powerful to know that Jesus doesn't care about your list, and that list of no matter how many people can be forgiven anyways.
Right.
And that's just,
And it's interesting to observe that the first ones, like I was saying, the first ones to extend grace are the older ones. And maybe they're not extending grace as much as they're trying to protect themselves. As far as, like, I know my sins, so I'm going to be the first to drop my rock.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's incredible.
Well, is there anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, we're so glad that you joined us today to listen to our thoughts, and we hope that you enjoyed it as much as we enjoy. And if you have questions or comments, please just leave them below. We'd love some feedback on this, or if there's any scriptures that you'd like to hear our thoughts on, let us know that too. But we hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week.
All right, God bless you.
Bye.